Okay, great. So I was mentioning you can choose to have your video on and off. We have a chat feature. Please definitely engage there. We love to see the comments and questions as we go along. We can also enable transcription. So if you want to have closed captioning in the webinar, you can do that. And then I already said this before, but please choose an interpretation language. We ask that you choose one because that way our interpreter can communicate with all of us, not just the Spanish speaking folks. And then you can use the reaction button to share any kind of reactions you have throughout the call. And then, yes, I will share the webpage for our climate justice series later on. Okay, so with that, we will go ahead and share some intros about who's behind this work. So I'll pass it over to you, Jamie, first.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to have you all here. I'm Jamie Strobel. I use she, her pronouns, and I was the original founder of the Climate Equity Community Task Force and co-author of the Sustainable and Resilient Frontline Communities section of the Strategic Climate Action Plan at King County that we're going to be talking a lot about the history of during this. So I worked for King County for almost 5 years as we did this work. And then I am no longer there, but Samara and Vicky Raya are amazing and kind of continuing on that work and really let's speak a little bit to where that's headed now. But we're here to kind of give a grounding to everybody in the work of all of the community members that made this possible at King County and what that holds for us as we move forward. I also do a lot of capacity building with the No EO pathways around climate and environmental justice. And in that work, I coordinate the Climate Justice Learning Series with Samara.
Hello. So yeah, I'm Samara Almonte. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm here representing the King County Executive Climate Office. Like Jamie mentioned, we create this climate justice learning series. I'm a climate equity coordinator with the office. I've been here for about 1.5 years almost. My background is in community organizing around climate justice and also what I call environmental justice storytelling. So thinking about multimedia channels to communicate environmental justice stories from frontline communities. I am part of the Purepecha community and diaspora here in Washington State. And with that, we actually will have 2 panelists in addition to Jamie today during our workshop. They were also part of the task force and the creation of the policies that we're going to share today, but I'll let them introduce themselves. So Dinah, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, please?
Good evening or afternoon, I guess it still is. I'm Dinah Wilson. I am previously worked for the City of Kent and Puget Sound Clean Air Agency, and I'm a community consultant now. I'm also a cohort advisor with the Magic Cabinet Foundation for 3 nonprofits, community-based nonprofits that are headquartered in Kent. And I'm also on the Neighbor to Neighbor Seattle Foundation Advisory Committee. And just looking forward to talking with you about climate change. I've been on the Climate Community Equity Task Force since its inception, and looking forward to sharing some of what our experiences have been with you.
Thank you, Dinah. And then I'll pass it over to Patu, our other panelist for today.
Atiktiwigwa Winishush Patu. I'm a member of the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. We're originally from Wemoth, Ichiwana, the Big River, aka Columbia River, and its tributaries. I am a White Center resident. I also was up on the task force pretty early on. I have an environmental background. I work for the State Department of Health on the Environmental Health Disparities Map and something called Washington Tracking Network. And I'm a White Center resident. And one of my mentors definitely said, okay, you have all this Western education. I need you to go get your cultural education. And so it's a little bit pixelated, but I put up my first kill, a ram hunt, which was something that really helped me process a lot of my grief and association with, and this is kind of triggering, but missing and murdered Indigenous people. And so it really helped me have that cultural connection and understand the environment better, but also that relief of grief. So really appreciate you all being here today. I definitely had some Monday gardening, like, oh my gosh, if they don't get roots down now, it's going to be a hot summer. So look forward to learning with you all and sharing.
Thank you, Patu and Dinah, and we look forward to hearing more from you all later in the workshop. So to get a little bit into the climate justice learning series, especially if this is your first one, so some of the goals with this is to develop a shared understanding around climate justice and climate equity. And actually it was the Climate Equity Community Task Force that Patu and Dinah were mentioning, and we'll talk more about later, that really asked for something like this, an opportunity to build communities' capacity. This also builds skill to advocate for policy change. We've specifically done workshops around policy skills, which we'll share in a bit. We also do this, to honor traditional and cultural knowledge around sustainability, which Patu was referring to a little bit in her introduction. We want to provide capacity building to lead and partner on climate solutions, but specifically partner with frontline communities and improve access to resources, funding, and decision makers. And although this is true for all our workshops, so we definitely want to make this clear for this one, is that our audience are frontline community members. This is who we have in mind when we design these topics and the information that is shared. I know that this specific workshop got a lot of popularity amongst like different government staff members, not just in King County, but across the region, which is great. And I'm glad that you all are here to learn, but I really hope that we can continue centering the voices, experiences, and learning of frontline community members, and that this is not necessarily an opportunity for us government folks to really put community frontline members in a position to teach us, like really, have to tell us like how to do community engagement. There can be other opportunities for that, and y'all are more than welcome to reach out to individual community members if they are open to doing that, but this will really center their experiences and how they want to move forward with working with government. And with that, just a little bit more about the learning series. So again, some past workshops. Unfortunately, only the Energy Justice 101 has been recorded, which you can find on our webpage that I'll share later on. But some of the other ones we've done have been on around power analysis and power building, policy and advocacy skill building, both at the state and local level, storytelling for climate, and then data for community. And so we will actually be taking a break in July and August. So this is the last one for this year as of now. And then later on in the fall/winter, we hope to cover topics such as U.S. Indigenous Peoples History and Rights 101. And there seems to be a lot of community interest around where is our trash going? What's happening with our different waste systems. So we hope to cover some of that later on in the year. And we also, I forgot to add it in this list, we also do a recurring Climate Justice 101 to again kind of bring that foundational information to community, and we will most likely repeat that workshop later on this year as well. But for today specifically, we'll be looking at understanding the history of the Sustainable Frontline and Resilient Communities, or SRFC section in the King County Strategic Climate Action Plan, uplifting stories of those who came before us in climate justice policy, and the impact of SRFC section beyond King County, and as it's just as important, dreaming the future of climate justice policy. We really have to make space for that so that we can do the work that will take to get there. And with that, I will actually stop sharing my screen and pass it over to my co-coordinator, Jamie.
Okay,
I was just going to say you're on mute.
Oh, thanks. We're going to start first with a Mentimeter. We're going to be using this because a lot of our content, and we have so many folks who RSVP'd, because so much of our content is so much of our content is going to be kind of talking at you, and you've got lots of people. We want to stay engaging, and so we're going to be using Mentimeter. I will pull that up right now. So we're going to drop the link into the chat. And I will share my screen so that folks can participate. So first of all, we'd love if folks can share, where are you calling in from today? So you can use the link in the chat. Also use your phone if you want. Either way works. Renton, South Seattle, Burien, Puyallup, Tacoma. Feel free to put your neighborhood too if you're in Seattle. You should be able to enter more than once if you want. Skyway, Yesler Terrace, White Center. This is a good practice question since we'll be using this throughout the session today. So got 23 responses. So I know that there are a handful of people still figuring it out. We can put the link back into the chat if folks who are replying using the chat, if you're at all able. Great. Okay, next question. What interested you about today's topic? And if you're having any technical trouble figuring it out, please ping one of us. Go ahead and take a moment to answer this question. Learning about climate justice policy, understanding the SRC section better. I'm glad folks are interested in learning more about the SRC section. Learning more about climate. Wanting to hear more stories from those working in climate justice. History of past efforts and what we can move forward. Great. I'll let a few more folks fill this out. Great. And we can drop the link back in again if anyone's having trouble figuring that out. Thank you, Samana. Great, we got a couple more responses. I love it. Okay, and then our last question, what is your previous experience with government and community partnerships? So the first answer is, I haven't interacted with government much. I work or have worked for government. I serve on a community advisory body for government. I have testified in front of a government body, a council, a legislature, or I have done more than 2 of these things. So go ahead and select your answer.
Wow, I'm kind of surprised. A lot of people have worked for government or work currently for government that are here. At least who are voting.
We got a couple of people who've done more than 2 of these things. It's pretty great. I have 17 participants. I'll wait till I get 25. Because I think that's how many folks we've been getting. Great, just a couple more folks. Maybe we should do a future workshop on testifying to your city council or your legislature. Great. I think I'm just waiting on 2 or 3 more people. This is great practice because we'll come back to this for a couple other times throughout this. So appreciate folks engaging. Okay, we'll call it. Thank you all for participating in that. We'll come back to our mentee later, but we'll get started with our presentation. So I'm going to come back to our presentation. Everyone see that okay?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. Congratulations, you did the Mentimeter. Okay. So we wanted to ground this again in what is community driven versus community formed. So this is a lot about the history of our climate justice policy work at King County. And a lot of that is rooted in the difference of how we did the work, not just what the work was. And so we wanted to provide some examples of tools we use to be able to make the case to our local government of why we should be doing things differently. One of the tools that that was utilized was from Nexus and from Build the Field. And they came out with this tool about what's the difference between doing outreach versus engagement. This was really a helpful tool to be able to explain to folks doing outreach or doing community engagement. I think when I first started at King County, there was a conflation between community engagement, outreach, and communication. Sometimes they were used interchangeably, and they're not the same thing. And there's also more to that in terms of what is beyond engagement towards true partnership, which we'll get to in a little bit. But I really appreciate this tool they put out that kind of breaks down what the difference is between just outreach versus community engagement. What kind of relationship do you have with community members? Is it a foundational relationship or a transactional one? Is it something that is inclusive, or does it reflect the diversity of the communities you're working with? Is this a time-limited relationship, or is it something that relationships are built with all sorts of people, not just the executive directors or the CEOs, but all sorts of folks from community and intentionally working to build up power in the community? Are those relationships short-term, or are they long-term? This is a very, very common one, right? How is government engaging those people? Is there a specific goal that they're trying to reach, or is it really to create space to elevate the local concerns, interests? You know, are they working to build power in those communities? Is it to seek buy-in or approval on something, or is it really to create space for community to identify their assets and want to get that recognized? They also talk a bit about, why are people being involved? So why is government trying to involve people? Is it to just primarily, is the outreach primarily looking like flyers or focus groups or surveys? Or is there something a little bit more engaged and involved, which is around leadership development or relationship building with one-on-one meetings? Are there listening sessions? Is this information is given after the project is already planned, or is the planning actually done with community in advance of a decision being made? How are those ideas generated? Is it the staff are coming up with ideas, or institutions are coming up with ideas, and then they ask community, do you like this or not? Or are community members actually a part of generating some of those ideas? Is there solution? Who's identifying the problem, and is staff generating those solutions, or communities a part of generating solutions as well? And then lastly, this is kind of looking at organizational structures and policies. Is the organizational culture fixed on obtaining specific outcomes, or is this a kind of focused on learning and changing and adapting to kind of longer term outcomes? What culture is dominating the ways that they operate? Is it using Robert's Rules of Order, for example, or other things that are reflecting white dominant culture? Or they're creating different spaces and ways of working, ways of holding meetings, ways of having gathering input and feedback? Is there a way in terms of how we're treating our elders versus youth, and things that happen often in different communities that aren't necessarily part of the way institutions function? And is the institution adapting to that? Is racism and power dealt with and addressed specifically to understand and dismantle structural racism? Or is it kind of dealt with superficially and with the right language, but not necessarily in practice? Is the organization driven primarily by are the policies and structures driven by the organization, or are they driven by a response to community needs and ideas? So I love this because it's a really clear, like, look at, these are two different ways you could do things. And asking the questions as those relationships are built and as government looks to engage with community members, how are you doing things differently? So I feel like this is a great tool to utilize when you're working with different agencies. Another tool that often gets used is called the Spectrum of Community Engagement. This is King County's version of it that came out about a little over 10 years ago. I think it's 2011. And they came up with this spectrum of community engagement, where the left side is community is just informed, all the way to community directs action. This is where you start to see some of those things of one-time interaction. It's a time-limited thing. So on the far left side, this is, it's the outside agency coordinating. There's primarily only one way of communication. There's one-time interaction. It's a limited time event. It's addressing an immediate need. And strategies are kind of what that looks like. So this is, maybe it's a pamphlet or a brochure or an article that has come out. This is not necessarily a bad thing, because there are instances where you just need to get as much information out as possible, right? So there's a public health emergency, for example, then I want to make sure we get the news out for that as quickly as possible. I'm going to pause for a moment just for our interpreter. So, for example, if there is a heat wave, then we want to make sure that everyone knows a heat wave is coming, and we want to get that out in as many languages as possible. And so this becomes more of, how are we making sure that that message is reaching everybody, and making sure that there's language access, and they're using multiple outlets. And so then the next stage of this is, what does it look like when community is consulted versus engaged in dialogue, versus how are we actually working together, communities and agencies working together. And then the last side is community directs action. So this is where community is actually leading things, driving things. And the role of the institution in that instance is really, how do we support? How does government support those communities? And so this might be, sponsoring community-led things, projects, or being a partner on a project that they're on the lead on, or developing coalitions and joint statements on different legislative things. And to Dinah's comment in the chat, I just want to highlight something Dinah said. So Dinah said, it's important that community and government understand the level of engagement and be honest about the intention, as it has an impact on relationships. So all of these activities can be laid out to say, we're doing some of these things, some of these things, some of these things, but really be honest about where those institutions are on this structure, so that you're not over-promising more. There's not over-promising of more than they can commit to, right? I wanted to share, this is an adapted version of that same community engagement spectrum that Movement Strategy Center put forward. And what I like about this is they kind of took it a step further. They said, we're going to add an extra column on the far left that is, what happens if you just ignore people? What happens if you don't engage at all? And that is, and that's the number 1 on here. And then they added what that impact is. So the impact here is marginalization. And the message that it sends to community is, your voice, needs, and interests don't really matter. And what does that look like? It means there are closed door meetings, there's misinformation, you can't even get information, and all of the resources are staying within the institution. So they also added this resource allocation section. Then they added, what does it look like to have inform the consult and involve with all of these other, what does that look like going further up the spectrum? So there's the, we'll keep you informed, the, we care about what you think, then we can't do this well without you, is the voice. And then your leadership and expertise are critical. And we want this to work, so we support equitable processes led by community. So, and you'll notice that the resourcing shifts and changes as well as you go farther up the spectrum. This is, apologies for this being blurry, but this is essentially the same thing you just saw, just slightly wider, so that you can kind of see it a little bit better. So questions to ask before you get into a partnership with community. So this is what it means to be. So we saw the left side of that spectrum is what happens when we're informing, right? What happens when we're driving? What does that look like? Well, the questions you have to ask before you get into any sort of partnership or join an advisory body or join any sort of relationship with government is some of these questions of, one is acknowledging power and authority. The questions I would ask are, who has the decision-making power? Who controls the resources? Who is implementing those decisions? Who are they accountable to? Are power dynamics being acknowledged when you particularly think about how they're setting up that body, whether if it's an advisory body or if it's a cabinet or if it's a commission or a board or if it's just a contract partnership? How are those power dynamics being acknowledged and addressed? Do they have a commitment to equity and practicing examining systems, processes for bias and barriers to equity? So for example, if you're getting a grant, how have they put in place processes to make sure that those grants are accessible, that you don't have to pay everything out of your own pocket up front? Have they actually tried to put in things there to try to make that grant process more accessible and equitable? Whose perspectives are being included and whose are not? When I get asked to sit on an advisory body or on a or commission, my first question always is, who else have you asked? Who else are you working with? Because if it turns out you're the only BIPOC organization that has been asked to sit on something, you don't want to end up in a situation where you might be the token. So continuing to ask, and then the question is, oh, well, have you thought about including these folks? Have you thought about expanding this? Have you thought about having an entire body that is made up of community members and community organizations? Like, there's an opportunity there to push as well if you don't get the answer that you want. Entering into a partnership for the right reasons, understanding the why. So what is their motivation for working with you? So why is this, if you are getting outreach from a government agency or entity, understanding why do they want to work with you? Is it because we have a specific deadline, so I just need your input so I can check the box on this? Or is it like, no, really, we want to make sure that we're putting forward the right things. We want to make sure that the resources will actually go to the right communities, or there are blind spots we can't see. Those are all great questions to think about. So you're like, yes, sounds like they are motivated by similar things or not. What is your motivation to work with them? So this is why do I want to engage with this, and weighing what is the cost of that, right? Is it staffing? Is it time? Is it money? Is it what's the cost to be able to be a part of that process? And then finding what is your common ground. Oftentimes when it's most effective is when there's a mutual benefit to being in that partnership. And then what I said about balancing this, are you contributing both energy, time, resources? Who's contributing that? And is that imbalanced in any way? Are you giving more than you get? And is that okay with you or not? Is there an opportunity to learn or teach? And is that worth the effort? And so part of this in here too is there might be an opportunity to, if I work with this agency, then maybe they will be able to work with other agencies in the future and other community organizations in the future, and it'll go well, right? And then kind of the last few things we talked about, long-term versus short-term, ensuring that we are trying to build long-term relationships usually. But if it is short-term, then being really intentional about why you're choosing a short-term relationship. Who is your contact, and do you trust them? Is this someone that you've built a relationship with in this agency? And if they leave, then would that work still be honored by the other folks who are left in that agency? And then lastly, acknowledging all forms of experience and knowledge as valid and meaningful. Are they valuing that, or is it everyone else has been invited to the table, has a PhD, and you're the only one that doesn't? Like, what sorts of knowledge are being valued in that space, and will your knowledge as a community member be valued in the same way? And are community members being compensated for their expertise? When we first started this, when we first started the SRFC section and the Climate Equity Community Task Force, it was still not the norm to compensate people for their time. And that was a fight in and of itself to be able to compensate community members. And now it's become more and more of the norm because people are asking for it. And people are asking, if I'm going to sit on this body and give you all of my knowledge, and you've spent all this money on consultants for all of their knowledge, then should we not also be compensated? So that has been something that has grown over time. More and more jurisdictions are doing it. More and more agencies are making that happen. So, Dinah or Patu, is there anything you wanted to add to this in particular? Or Samara?
I think you did a very thorough job, Jamie. Covering everything, so I don't have anything to add. Other than I made a couple of comments in the chat.
Patu?
I'm good for right now, thanks.
Yeah, this is a pretty extensive list. Although I just want to take this quick break to remind people that just joined to please choose an interpretation channel. We do have an interpreter, and that way, if you don't need interpretation, just by being in the English channel, she can communicate with the rest of us. Y si ocupa interpretación, tenemos interpretación en español. Gracias.
Thanks, Mara. And then the last bullet point I had on here was do your research and learn the history. So understand whose shoulders you're building off of in that. Understand who else has that agency worked with. What other community organizations have they worked with? If you know them, reach out to them and say, hey, what was your experience? Did it go well? This is a thing that sometimes we don't know what has happened in the past, and then you enter into a partnership, and you might find that is not what you wanted to have happen, or you might find out later kind of what are some of the residual impacts of that. Or you might get a really great heads up that says, yes, definitely work with them. They're really great. So you never know, but if you ask around, there's often folks who will be able to help support you in that. Okay, that was the last really text heavy slide, hopefully, because I know that that's a lot. We're going to talk specifically about climate justice policy and the SRFC section, and just to give everyone kind of the same grounding and background. So we talked about community driven versus community informed. Now we're going to get into kind of the policy and research work that has happened in our region specifically, and whose shoulders we build off of. So a lot of the work in King County has gone back over 10 years. And in 2014, the Climate Justice Community Committee started. That was a partnership between Got Green and Puget Sound Sage. And they got together and did a community-based participatory research project. And I was on this original community committee when I was working for interim CDA. And we developed out this survey because at the time, so much data around climate was coming from, was centered around mitigation. It was centered on just generally looking at Washington State as a whole, or not necessarily looking at frontline communities or communities of color and those who were impacted the most by climate change. And so community-based participatory research is a tool that is basically research done by community. And so Puget Sound Sage and Got Green worked together with this committee, and we put together a survey. We went all across South Seattle and we were in front of grocery stores and in front of bus stops and schools, and just asking people to take our survey And in the way we designed the survey, we didn't have, we only mentioned the words climate change once at the very beginning. And it was, what do you associate with climate change? And folks answered that question. And then the rest of the questions were just about like, do you care about these things? And it was things like air quality or affordable housing or food security, and I'll show a few of those graphs. So I'm going to skip ahead to that. So this is one of the questions that we asked is, do these issues impact you in your neighborhood? Keep in mind, this is pre-wildfire smoke season. So, because that didn't really start until about 2017 or so. But this report came out in 2016, and affordable housing and a lack of affordable housing was number one. And that has continued, I'm sure. And also poor air quality has kind of risen since then in terms of concerns amongst folk. But you'll see when we asked about climate impacts of most concern to respondents, rising food costs, increases in disease and health concerns, extreme weather events, heat waves and air quality are probably again higher now because they've become more prominent in our communities. But this was a really pivotal report because it ended up a lot of times in white dominant culture, there's this thing called worship of the written word, which is if it's written down and it's in a fancy report, then it's got to be true and it's got more legitimacy attached to it. And you're more likely to be listened to, especially when you have great graphic design. So these community organizations knew that. So they used the opportunity. Let's take all of the data of what we already know is true in our communities, but let's turn that into graphs and charts and a report with pictures and put that forward. And it started to make the rounds. And when I came to King County several years later, I had departments and folks who actually were like, have you seen this report? And they actually had copies of it. And they were like, this is why we need to prioritize these things. So it really started to make an impact in terms of changing what was prioritized and how people were talking about climate change. So controlling that narrative and starting to push that narrative a little bit. The other thing that happened in 2016 was Multnomah County came out with their climate action plan in 2015. And they were one of the first local jurisdictions to really have a community-driven climate justice like lens on their climate plan. So they produced their plan in 2015 and they were like, there's not really any equity in here. And so they brought together a community committee for over a year, and they went through the entire climate plan and they pulled out, these are the different pieces that that you could change this goal or you could add this extra goal to make sure that it's more equitable. And then they produced this report called Climate Action Through Equity that was the foundation. So they paid people for their time. They had an ongoing body made up entirely of frontline community members and communities of color. And they had gotten a grant to work on this. So sometimes jurisdictions don't have the funding or the resources. And so they had gotten a grant to make this possible. Because this happened, there was a precedent then in government. Government loves precedent. So being able to do something completely new or different is often challenging. You have to show some precedent for someone else has already taken that risk. And here's why we could do it, and we could do it a little bit better, right? So that's why people sometimes complain about government taking so long, because we're often building off of what's happened before. So Multnomah County was critical because that showed that there was a model to have community members directly inform what goals go into a climate plan. As a result of that, yes, thank you, Dinah, that's in Oregon. Multnomah County is in Oregon. That's the county that Portland, Oregon is in. So as a result of that work, the Environment and Equity Initiative agenda became a thing because they had seen what was happening in Multnomah County, and Sudananda Gopal, who was the program manager at the time, said, we can make this happen in Seattle, and we can apply some of that model and expand on it even more. And so this time they were like, we're going to have community drive and direct what goes into an environment and equity agenda, centering community voices, centering communities of color. And so I was on this committee as well before I came to the county, and with my community hat, I was running an environmental justice youth program at the time. And so they really tried to pull people who came from different backgrounds and different, worked in different contexts and community, put together this community of color led committee, the original climate equity, environment and equity agenda, environment and equity initiative, community partner steering committee. Government loves acronyms and loves ridiculously long names, as you will see. So this community partner steering committee was the original committee that came together to come up with all the goals that would go into this report. So this is a foundational report, came out also in 2016. That was a big year for us in the region. You can read more about what happened and what those goals are. But one of the things in here was to ensure that that work didn't just die off with that report. And so the Environmental Justice Committee at the city came out of this work and is now the permanent ongoing body that stewards the work of the Environment and Equity Initiative. The challenge that they had with this is that it was kind of falling under a mayoral initiative. So you have your executive and you have your legislative branches of government, right? So in the city, it's the mayor and the city council. In the county, it's the county executive and the county council. And so this, because it was a mayoral initiative, when you get a change in administration and a new mayor, the new mayor might say, this is not my priority, or I want to make my own mark on this, so we need to change that to what my new thing is, right? And oftentimes you'll get like new initiatives kind of rebranded, or that work will get combined with something else for under a new mayor. So this meant that this work, is slightly different today. Luckily it is still continued and is still going on, but that is the risk there is with any sort of work like this that doesn't have teeth to it, right? There's not necessarily like legislation, or it doesn't have to pass through the city council as an official plan of any sort. So when we went then to build, I'll kind of get to the county example shortly, but this is just one other resource that really informed our work as a guide. So this came out in 2017. That was a lot of folks across the country involved in the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. I highly recommend this as a resource for folks to look into. So when we went to the county then, and the opportunity was, they would just come out with the strategic climate, they had just come out with a 2015 strategic climate action plan. Right after that in 2016 was the county had come out with the, sorry, I need to find the right, oh, I don't know where that slide went. Okay. So the county had come out with the Equity and Social Justice Strategic Plan in 2016. So it meant that when we got to updating the Strategic Climate Action Plan in 2020, there hadn't been an opportunity to kind of integrate the Equity and Social Justice Plan and the Climate Plan. So there wasn't a whole lot of equity in the 2015 plan. There were some great early attempts, but there wasn't a true kind of crosswalk or integration of that. And so the 2020 plan was really an opportunity to do that, to come up with how are we going to do this, centering equity and social justice, and what would that look like. When I first got brought in, though, there was this story of, kind of how government as usual would do this is like, we draft our thing, we have feedback, we then go out to community and we decide So this is on the right side. So normally it's like, okay, we're going to initiate the project, we'll collect some data, we'll come up with a few options, we'll develop a bit of a plan, and then we'll take that out for feedback. And then we'll incorporate that feedback and then plan the project and then, keep moving forward. Maybe that often looks like, here's our 3 community meetings, or here's our open public houses, or whatever that is, which are valid tools of engagement, but it cannot be the only thing, right? And so when we started working on this, we started thinking like, we need to figure out how we can do this in a way that is actually working in partnership with community members and building off of what our regional colleagues have done. And so the opportunity was, can we actually build a community driven section rather than having those folks just advise on, instead of having them just advise on, reviewing here the mitigation goals, what do you think? Like add in equity, which is what Multnomah County did at the time, which was super innovative at their time, right? We are continuing to build off of that. So then we're like, let's follow what the Environment and Equity Initiative had done of building out a community-driven committee that would come up with the goals, come up with the objectives, but then can we take that a step further? So instead of having something that might be subject to a change in administration or that didn't have a whole lot of teeth, we said, let's actually create a climate justice section, its own section of the plan, that community is coming up with these goals that then lives within the actual climate plan. So a lot of times there's like, government was doing separate reports. So here's our separate equity report on this topic or this separate. And oftentimes those were things that would sit on a shelf or get looked at every once in a while. But if you're not building it into the actual plans, then there's no sort of accountability to it. So this way, building it into the actual climate plan meant that not only did it have to go through the executive to get approved, it also had to go through the council and then get approved and voted on at the council level. So now there's like multiple elected officials that are involved and that have a stake in making sure that this is successful. So that was strategically the next evolution of this, was to give it a little bit more teeth. So we built the first ever climate justice framework for King County. This was a multi-year effort that we will walk through, that many community members, some of whom are on this call, were deeply involved in. And we came up with the Sustainable and Resilient Frontline Communities section. Fun fact, that was not the original name for this section. And we kind of came up with this as a placeholder at the time. And then all of a sudden it got written into legislation, and then we couldn't change it. So that is how we ended up with a name that is really long, and some people are like, why do you have this long crazy acronym SRFC? That's why. But this was really pivotal for its time because of the fact that we were truly having community drive a lot of the work. So I'll walk through a little bit of what we accomplished during that time. So this is what I was talking about the Strategic Climate Action Plan and then the Equity and Social Justice Plan. The SCAP, as we like to call it, pre-2020 had only 2 sections. It was how do you mitigate and reduce carbon and GHGs, greenhouse gases, and how do we prepare for climate impacts? So those are the 2 sections. It wasn't until 2020 that we had the 3rd section of the SRFC section. And this section, it was actually kind of, it wasn't immediately welcomed as being its own section. I think there was a few things that went into that of You know, do we really need to do the work of another section? And this is often something I hear doing work in climate and equity is, can we just put equity in everything? Shouldn't it be sprinkled in the other sections too, and not just its own section? And our argument was that it needed to be both, that you need to have, of course you need to have equity incorporated into the greenhouse gas section and the preparedness section. But we also needed to have a space the community had ownership of and direction of, because that was not really possible in other sections in the same way. So that's why we're like, it's going to be both. So there is some overlap, you'll notice. And in the plan, you'll actually see there's little icons that's like, oh, you'll also see this in the preparedness section, or you'll also see this in the greenhouse gas section. And that's okay. Some of the definitions we use, frontline communities, you'll often hear being used as a term. This is specifically to identify those who are disproportionately impacted by climate change, those who are kind of quote unquote on the front lines of climate change. These are populations who often experience the impacts of climate change first and worst. They face historic and current inequities and have limited resources to adapt. So this is often those who are, it might be a whole bunch of different factors. So it might be if you already have existing health issues and you're low income and you, and maybe you are also a person of color who has suffered from a lack of generational wealth. All of those things kind of factoring together in terms of who is impacted. We use this resource a lot to be able to explain that intersection of all those different things, those different identities, those different access to resources, different access to privilege, social factors, health, biological factors, as a way to explain this. And so we definitely are like, the history of racism and segregation are definitely climate justice issues. Income inequality and economic injustice is a climate justice issue. A lack of affordable housing is a climate justice issue. So oftentimes when we're in community, I've heard community members say that, well, I'm not really an environmentalist. I don't really, I focus on all these other issues. Climate change might not be my thing. And I say everything's connected to climate change. And when we think about where money is now and where there might be community resources available, a lot of social services are getting cut right now. But what's not getting cut is money to fight climate change. So there's also a benefit of being able to tie what your mission is and what work you do to climate change could also open up other funding opportunities for you all and other partnership opportunities. Some other definitions that I'll just put out here for folks, and I apologize because this is a text heavy slide and I did say that there wouldn't be. There's one more. So this one is one of the things we really wanted to emphasize was the difference between climate equity and climate justice. A lot of times those terms were getting used interchangeably, and the difference is that justice work requires a shift in power, and it means that it is being led by and inclusive of the leadership of frontline communities and those most vulnerable to climate impacts. And so, so if you're doing work I'm looking at all the data and I'm saying what health outcomes are the worst or where the heat dome is the worst, I'm going to prioritize planting trees in that neighborhood, then that is climate equity work. You are working to change the inequities in that community. It's great work. Really important. However, it's not climate justice unless it's saying, hey, I did all this data and research around which neighborhoods experience the most heat and I could plant trees there, but I'm going to go work with community and talk to folks and say, where do you prioritize? What would you want to do? Where would is planting trees even the right solution, or are there other solutions? What do you want to see? And then working with those communities to make that happen. That's more of the justice side, because it's actually community leading and directing in that instance. So that's something we wanted to emphasize when we're working with different jurisdictions, to explain that. Okay. I'm going to keep zooming ahead because I want to make sure we have enough time for our amazing panelists. The other thing to think about is that when I was working with the county to bring this forward, we were talking about, you know, we can't just jump into things. You can't just like work with communities and expect them to trust you, expect them. There's a long history of distrust towards government, and in many times for very good reason. And I have been on the other end of that as working in community-led organizations where we didn't have the best experience, or we felt like our data and information was used and then we never heard back from people ever again, or we were getting compensated a fraction of what a mainstream organization was getting compensation. So there's so many things that need to be acknowledged to overcome, and we need to acknowledge that, like, is government actually ready to do this sort of work, to do community driven work, right? Then is community ready? So if you're going to work on something really technical like climate change or greenhouse gas emissions reduction, do we speak the same language? Is government able to understand the language we're using in community? And is community able to understand the language that government is using? And there's a lot of work to be done there in advance of ever engaging on what is our plan, right? So we did a bunch of work around this. So if we go back to that spectrum, that community engagement spectrum, we were like, we're going to do something in all of these buckets. And so we were like, we're going to do climate change communications that we co-develop with community organizations in multiple languages. And then we're going to make sure that we have, you know, partner with communities on events and producing materials, doing community workshops, and then actually working with the task force to develop out what the solutions are, and then what community-driven efforts can we actually just support and as a county step back, right? So what that looked like is we partnered with Utopia Washington to do a climate change infographic that was all in Samoan. And then we did one with Mother Africa that was all in Arabic. We did one in Chinese, we did one in Spanish, we did one. And in each of these, the examples we used actually shifted depending on the community. So you'll see on the Samoan one, a lot of the examples of climate change are coming from the Pacific Ocean. And then for Arabic, the globe is shifting and is focused more on North Africa, Middle East, and the Atlantic. And then when we go towards agencies and communities working together, we had the Climate Equity Community Task Force composed of a lot of different amazing folks, which I will, come back to that. A lot of different amazing folks from all over Seattle and King County, with a focus on those coming from frontline communities and coming from South Seattle and South King County, although folks were from all over King County. A lot of different workshops and thinking through what is our vision, what is the goal, what does community want to see 5 years from now, 10 years from now. So many sticky notes, so many poster papers. And then also a lot of like talking directly to leadership. So the middle picture on the left here is task force members talking directly with King County department leads and saying, this is what we want to see. This is what we've been coming up with so far. There were the bottom left or bottom right are folks who went to go speak to the King County Board of Health. and these are all the folks who were a part of the original task force. And many of these people have turned over, but some of these people are still on the task force, like Dinah and Patu, which you'll hear from shortly. We had 22 people from over 16 different organizations. We also made it a point to say, we don't just want like the executive director of a community, a community organization. We want the person who's on the ground doing the work. And if you want to send your executive director, then you need to pick a second person as well, who is going to be ideally a younger person who's newer to the work, who maybe wants to grow and learn and get experience in policy development work. This is really critical because executive directors are extremely busy people and can't always make every single meeting. So having a second person who could loop them in and let them know what's happened worked really well. And then the other thing that worked well was it was also about, again, it's how we do the work, not just what we produced. It was living into that value of making sure we are creating that pathway and pipeline for our community members that come after us, right? Our youth that are coming after us. The only reason I feel like I got my job at King County was because I was given the opportunity to be on the Environment and Equity Initiatives Community Partner Steering Committee. Prior to that, I didn't have a lot of experience in policy work, but because I was able to be on that, and because they asked me, and as a program manager and not the executive director, I was able to get that experience and build off of that. And this worked really well. We had several folks who brought a second person, some of whom were volunteers for that organization or a youth leader who now actually ended up with permanent jobs in those community organizations or in the field. So, and that's the goal, right? Bring more people in, more BIPOC folks into the sector and into the field and in leadership roles. So I will end with an overview of what's in the SRFC section. This is, we ended up with 8 different focus areas so this was over about a 2-year period because COVID happened in the middle of us developing this out. So all the pictures you saw were right before COVID happened. And we were in some of the final refinement of our goals, and COVID happened and everyone had to pivot towards doing diaper drives and food drives and helping to support your communities. And at the time, folks internally at the county didn't want to lose momentum. So even though we had gotten an extension from the county council for an extension of 3 months of the due date, a lot of folks were like, we're not going to change the deadline because we want to keep moving forward. This is why it's so important to have an inside community advocate and someone that you're working with that you can, who can advocate internally, because I was like, absolutely not. We need to use this extension. It's an equity issue. The folks who are working on other sections get to work from home and are not necessarily like on the ground trying to run food drives. If you're working for a mainstream environmental organization, it's a little bit different, right? And so I said, if we're going to do this and we really want to center equity, we are going to take that extension. We're going to give people the time and resources. We're going to connect them to COVID resources. And then when it's time and it's appropriate and folks are ready and feel the capacity, we'll continue, which luckily many folks were like, we don't want to lose this. We want to make sure we follow through. So we had to shift completely to virtual to get this across the table. I'm going to quickly, we talked about also strategically 6 different strategies of how we do this work in those 8 focus areas. One was making sure the county has internal capacity to prioritize climate equity. Does that mean like educating staff, letting them know what's in the section? Do they understand the difference between equity and justice? Do they know what are best practices for working with community members? prioritizing language access and translation, interpretation. How do we advance frontline community leadership and tribal partnerships, building community capacity, and what's that infrastructure to lift up community leadership? Addressing root causes of vulnerability. So this is going back to like, when you look at that big chart of like all the vulnerabilities, how are we making sure we're not just addressing, oh, everyone who has asthma, we're going to work more on this. How we look at why are there disproportionate rates? Why does this neighborhood have more asthma than other neighborhoods? And what does that mean for where we're planting trees when we're doing our tree strategy, right? So there's a lot of different ways to integrate that. Then equitable climate future meant as we start to put in solutions, so not just about preparing, but as we start to put in solar panels or electrifying our bus fleets, how do we make sure that those benefits are going to those most impacted and not just those who can afford to put solar panels on the house that they already own, right? So this is making sure that those solutions to climate change benefit frontline communities. And then aligning efforts is just the county has a lot of different efforts and different plans that have similar goals. So how you make sure that they're actually talking to each other. I talked about, so this is really briefly, I'm going to try to do this in like 2 minutes. The first goal area of community leadership and capacity building, this is about making sure there is community-driven language access, that we're supporting leadership development, that we're supporting understanding of the issues. So the Climate Justice Learning Series came out of a goal in this section of how do we provide more tools for folks to be the policymakers and to be at those tables. There's a Green Jobs and Pathways one, trying to change the representation and make sure that there's more diverse representation in the environmental sector. This is a key one that came out of that it's not in a lot of other climate plans, and so this was a new one. Community health and emergency preparedness, looking at how do we make sure frontline communities have the resources to be resilient to a lot of the health impacts of climate change. Housing security and anti-displacement. So as you saw in the Got Green and Puget Sound Sage report, this was a new section to the plan at the time. And it was also one of the ones that was the most controversial because community identified the link between affordable housing and displacement with climate change, saying, if I have to move farther and farther away from where I work, then I have to drive because I'm also moving farther away from transit access. And then I'm also potentially moving farther away from my community or from people who speak my language or people who are my cultural resources, and what that means in terms of resilience in the event of a climate emergency. Food systems and food security. This was also another one that was brand new to this section and also a little bit controversial to include as well. And some of this was us trying to socialize and make acceptable the narrative that these are climate issues, that food security, that housing are also climate issues, even though that's something that had been talked about a lot within community for years, it hadn't necessarily made its way into a climate plan for a local jurisdiction yet. And so being able to draw those connections and put it in there. At the time, we had so many lofty dreams of what we wanted to put in those sections. But at the end, it became, we had our Climate Equity Task Force working very closely with an internal advisory group of key staff across departments that helped us identify what was actually doable in each of these sections. So this was a partnership. It wasn't just community coming up with like, we want to dismantle all these things or add in all these things. It was also looking realistically at what the county could actually do. And then within that, not only were we looking at what could the county actually do, it then became what will the executive and the council approve? What will our leadership approve us putting in here? And at the time, even though there was more things we would have wanted, we were like, at this point, the win is just getting those sections in, getting these acknowledged as climate related and climate justice issues is the win. And then the next step is for those that come after us to take that a step further and think about what else we could build. And then we had energy justice and utilities as a new section as well, looking at utility burden and energy burden. We partnered with Puget Sound Sage when we talked about things we're doing that the county's following and communities leading. Puget Sound Sage led another report focused on energy justice. And then lastly, transit access was a big one. And I know Metro, we partnered with Metro's mobility cabinet that also had a whole bunch of frontline community members focused specifically on transportation. And we worked to elevate a lot of their recommendations in this climate plan so that it was in both places and really aligning those efforts. So that's the overview of all the things. And since then, there have been a lot of ripple effects. We have now had statewide climate policies that have happened, the creation of the Environmental Justice Council at the state level, the passage of the HEAL Act, the environmental health disparities map is now something that's being used all across the state with different legislative laws. And then there's other governing bodies that have built off of a lot of this work. I'll pass to Samantha to wrap that up.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. Yeah, so now within King County itself, we have different groups like the King County Equity and Social Justice Plan. There's been community group around that. Communities of Opportunity is another area where, as the name implies, there's a lot of communities involved in shaping policy. There's also the Solid Waste Division, Zero Waste Task Force, Metro Mobility Equity Cabinet, Open Space Equity Cabinet within Department of Natural Resources, and a community planning work group, which was part of the thinking about displacement and housing issues, and again, having community voices in that. We've also seen other bodies grow in the city of Seattle with, again, the EDI, Equitable Development Initiatives, Environmental Justice Committee, Seattle Transportation Equity Work Group, and even at the Washington state level, we have an Environmental Justice Task Force, and just some other jurisdictions have also come up with similar. And actually in the next slide, we have a couple other examples that are still within our region, but maybe just right outside of King County. So we have through the Puget Sound Regional Council, there comes in a lot of different, this is a way for all the different, areas, jurisdictions to come together, and they put out an equitable engagement for comprehensive plans. And they also have a similar model thinking about identifying impacted communities, but also thinking about how we engage with them, building relationships to actually be part of the process. And then just some two other ones that I found interesting was, Tacoma and Pierce County is developing a climate leadership cohort with youth, super important to include youth in this work. And then the city of Spokane has an environmental justice and equity work group. So, I know we have people join from different areas in this call. So, yeah, it just really shows that, maybe you're not directly in King County or as able to join these efforts, but maybe where you live right now or where you work, there could be other ways that you can get involved. And then these last couple slides before we jump into our panel is I just want to give you all a sense of where we're going with the 2025 SCAP update. So as Jamie mentioned, we update this plan every 5 years. So right now we're working on that update. We definitely want to be more strategic. It's always good to reflect on what are the areas that need to have even more impact, have to be elevated even more. We definitely want to continue working on the 2020 priorities, but just really push them further to that community ownership place in the spectrum, if you think of it that way. And then continue focusing on county-wide and government operations. How can we operate better to really support climate equity? Leverage expanding funding. There's been a lot of funding coming from the federal level, and unfortunately, us local government are kind of the middle people, so we often will be the ones accessing those federal funds, but then we want to make sure we get that to community and integrate other King County plans that we've been sharing, and strengthen community leadership, which I'll talk a little bit more about, and stronger regional alignment for implementation, because again, we don't live in a silo, right? King County, just like the boundaries of the way that are set up with jurisdiction is very arbitrary sometimes. And so we want to make sure we're collaborating with all these different areas that we meet. And yeah, with the thinking about the climate equity part, so we have, still our task force, it's still very much active. But we wanted to expand on that to allow for other new folks to come in. So we're building this climate equity work group that will be about, again, 20 compensated members, and it will have current and former task force members. But then we also put out an input or an interest form between June 3rd and June 17th, so just a couple weeks ago, to get new frontline members to sign up. And so right now we're in the process of interviewing those folks, very short, 20-minute interviews, but just to get a sense of who has the capacity and can be a good fit to be part of this. And primarily that is a strong representation of their community, right? We want to make sure that these are folks that are going to take that information back and include folks along the way. And they will support us with public engagement efforts. So if you can go to the next slide, actually, Jamie, if you're thinking about like, well, I didn't get to sign up for the climate equity work group, like how can I be involved? We do have this is our proposed timeline for the SCAP update. Sorry, I should like slow down. I'm trying to get to the panel. So right now we're in June now, so engagement is beginning. We're going to start doing some workshops. And we'll be releasing a survey soon, which will continue into July, where we can share it out to the public and everyone can comment on this plan. And this is also a good opportunity, if you work for a specific community-based organization and you would like us to come and present about the update and maybe do like some sort of community feedback session there, please like email me. I can put my email in the chat or just drop it in the chat now and we can look into that. And then, the timeline as it keeps going, we'll have eventually start drafting an actual plan that we will present to council. And we're hoping to actually have this whole 2025 SCAP update be done by next Earth Day. So that would be in 2025. So it's a pretty tight timeline, but we are doing, the best that we can to ensure that we center frontline communities and their feedback across. And that's, positions like mine that have been able to get added to the county to do that kind of work. So with that, I really want to.
So huge, by the way, that Samara is there, and Vicky's there, and like the team has expanded dramatically since I was there. Yes. We're just so thrilled that Samara is there continuing on the work, and Vicky. So
thank you.
and Michael leading up the green jobs work. It's just a lot of really great folks now.
Yeah, and really like, we talked about this a lot with Jamie when preparing for this workshop, that we wanted to acknowledge whose shoulders we stand on. Like I couldn't do this work today. Like when I was in undergrad, this is like the work I dreamed of doing when I was in undergrad, but I was like, there's no way I'll be able to like actually have a position that's titled like something climate justice or climate equity. And here I am, a climate equity coordinator, right? So between the time I was an undergrad to now, like so much has changed, and I can only imagine what will be available for our future generations. With that, we'll transition over to our panel discussion because we definitely want to hear from our community experts, Dinah and Pot 2. And again, this is being recorded, so if you're like, I need to be making dinner or I need to be doing something else, like totally feel free to do so. Oh my gosh, why is my screen being funny? Okay, there we go. Thank you for pinning them as well. Jamie, I was just going to do that. So with the panel, we already got to hear a little bit about who Pot 2 and Dinah are. So we'll just kind of jump in. So, all three of you have very different experiences working with community, working with government based on your own upbringing and work and background. But could you share a little bit more about what does effective collaboration look like between community and government? And I'll pass it to you, Dinah, first.
Effective collaboration. You went over a lot of that in the slides, Jamie. But one thing that I think that is really important is to think about some of those questions that you ask yourself. What is this collaboration going to look like? Who will be at the table? Is it going to be balanced? Does the organization that I work with, do they understand power imbalance and things of that nature? Do they understand equity? Are they afraid to use the word race and racism? A lot of government entities are afraid to even say those terms. So, if people have a hesitancy, that means they have a lot of education that needs to be done. I think it's so important to ask yourself those questions on the front end, because if that relationship doesn't go well, then there can be fallout, right? Because it could be a governmental entity that's a funder, that has some funding capacity, and most government entities have a lot of influence. So it's good to ask those questions from the front end, so that hopefully you can get some of those things rectified, rather than going in and being like, I'm skeptical, or I don't know the answer to this. And then later on you go, wow, I wish I had known, because I think maybe we would have tried to make some changes, or we would have not engaged in this relationship, because they take a lot of time and effort. And at the end of the day, ultimately, you want to know what you're trying to accomplish, what government's trying to accomplish, what you're trying to accomplish. And getting to those accomplishments, getting those things happen over time, and ultimately is about building long-term relationships. If that's what one of the intentions is, sometimes you may have just a short-term relationship, but I often find, if you're going to be in the community, you're going to be working on this particular area and other areas, it's good to build those long-term relationships, because that really pays off down the road. I can't emphasize that enough.
Yeah, thank you, Dinah. And I feel like the relationship can change, or your position can change, right? Especially if you're in a long-term relationship. Like maybe, I see you all like going into elders, right? Y'all are elders in the making. Like I'm learning a lot from Jamie, who's been doing this a lot longer. And one day I'm going to be the Jamie of the world and like passing on knowledge, And so I think it's also important to understand like our role as we grow in this work. Yeah, what do you think, Patu?
Yeah, I really appreciate Dinah's response and agree. We kind of went over a lot of the, so I'll just maybe accentuate. I do feel like the point around history is really good, because how often it's easy to frame things as problem solution, but a lot of times when that happens, community is framed as having the problem. Like, what the heck? You're the problem. So I think having some of that context can be really helpful. I think I've worked for government for a year now, so now I'm like answering from a governmental perspective. Ouch. Um, yeah, and I really agree with that relationship building piece. And lately I've been feeling like super at risk for displacement too. So I almost recognize my impermanence in an area. And so I feel like some of the things that I think we've asked kind of for low bars too, just to be like, hey, I want you to not be racist in the space, like things like that. And I think that's kind of a low bar for government, but it's happened.
Yeah.
I think I'm rambling a little bit, sorry.
No,
I
no
feel
problem.
like I feel like the racial and tribal histories are both super important. Like for me, I was talking to somebody and they were really upset, and it was terrible what they were saying. They were talking about not wanting things to be translated, and they felt like that was too social servicey. And I was like, the only reason landowners are um largely white demographically is because that's what the law supported. And so it's like things like that that really help us identify, like, how did we get here? Like, why is it so segregated within the environment? Because implicit racism looks a lot like explicit racism really fast if you're willing to unpack some of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we
Mm.
have to grasp things at the root cause, right? And that is racial discrimination and violence that has happened to Black and Indigenous people on this land. Did you want to add anything else, Jamie? I know you did talk quite extensively about community engagement in the.
Yeah, I just wanted to shout out that both Dinah and Patu are both amazing, like, community leaders, but also now have also experienced working within government institutions. And I think that as many of us start to end up in roles within the institutions too, of like what that experience is like, trying to be the one like opening doors and making things happen, and And I'm kind of curious what both of your reflections are in terms of like having been on both sides.
That's a great point, and I know you raised the two by two, and I think it's so important to understand that dynamic. So, in other words, if you're working on a community-based organization side, and you are meeting with someone like Batu or myself when we're working in government, we're oftentimes experiencing some of those same issues that you're experiencing, from our institutions. One of my colleagues pointed that out to me. He had never done community engagement, and he was a man he was of African descent, and he just said, I'm in the middle trying to help people and tell them things, and I'm feeling all of these racial things that are happening at the institution, and you don't oftentimes don't know where to carry that because you don't want that to negatively impact the relationship you're having with the community members you're working with, and so you really have to have a space and a place to acknowledge that and have a community around you to deal with that. And I know Jamie, Batu, and Samara and I, we all have talked about this, and you got to have that community around you so you can release that, and you have people who've experienced that and understand what you're going through, so you're not sort of having the community members that you want to be of assistance to and you want to be an advocate for, that you're not sort of traumatizing them with that. So it's just important to know that that will happen quite frequently, and it really is something that's a challenge to deal with. But I do think that having a community where you can express it can help you navigate through that.
Mhm. Definitely. Did you want to add anything else, Batu, about your reflection? Now, you kind of shared a little bit about what it's been like for you working in government now.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've tried really hard, and so now I'm in a position where I'm trying things different. I was actually really shocked by the level of change that needs to happen within government. I know I was surprised to hear, just the different things that some people of color experience, specifically in multiple government settings. And I mean, I don't really know, but I agree with the support system. I don't think I usually have enough outside support. I tend to find mentorship within the spaces I'm in, but then I'm like, do we all, like, but then you find your people. Like I had an elder that used to laugh and she'd be, we'd be working on education till midnight and she'd be like, y'all just found more people like you. And so like maybe finding some mentors that are not like you can be really helpful. Um, but with that said, I mean, I usually just remind myself about how, I'm a Yakama descendant and Queemith, I believe that was his name. Um, but like like within very recent history, we've had atrocities against Native people in the governmental setting. And so for me, when I'm in government, I'm not like feeling super comfortable and I recognize that. And so I did get like them to change the name of the town hall to something else because I was like, I don't have a good connotation with towns, and a lot of the local tribes probably don't either. They're very much kind of like frontier establishments right next to our res where things are very hostile. And then there's like a vacuum, of services and things like that. So you have to go into these places that are adversarial. And so I guess that's what it kind of feels like maybe there's a little bit more adversity also in government than you would expect. And so when you're in those spaces, you're really batting for community. But to be able to do that, it's like what Dinah talked about is taking some time like to step back and have whatever restorative is there for you.
Sounds like I'm hearing too that the community needs to also step up to support those of us that end up in those spaces.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, and also let's like just point out that, this panel is all like folks that identify as women or have experienced, this work also as like women and femme presenting. And that is also a different layer of draining and adversity that happens as well. So yeah, I think like that could be its own presentation. Like the intersectionality of being, a person of frontline communities working in spaces like this that were designed not for us at all, right? And what does that look like, and how does that sometimes create more violence? But kind of maybe transition to something a little bit more positive and thinking more about like what is the value of this work? Like what are you most proud of your time working on the SRC section? And we can start with Dinah again if you want.
Yes, I think Atu and I had similar things that we were proud of. I'm very proud of the fact that this was a long process. It was a lot of fun too, because we were in a safe, welcoming, and loving space. And I give so much credit to Jamie for that. And we really, didn't have to go to a space that was not welcoming, but we were welcome, and you felt like this was your place. These were your peeps, and that made it so much nicer. So it was enjoyable to go to the meetings, and we always had food, and but we knew that a lot was going on behind the scenes, that it was a tedious process to get this through. And, we were getting some pushback. And Jamie has so many stories around that. But, we got a lot of resistance. But Jamie also found her people, and I know her allies, within government as well, that really helped her get this through, and was a sounding board for her. But, we had to figure out, how to use our voice and support Jamie and the work she was doing. But at the end of the day, we got it. It happened, and we were very proud of what we accomplished together. And that was also so great because we worked together and we got it done. And you had people in the room who looked like you, who or been through some similar experiences that you've gone through. Also, people who've gone through dissimilar experiences that you could learn from. And it was just amazing. And one of the things I always say about this is, we do have voice, we have power, and that is an example of the power we have. And when we say to ourselves we don't have power, we don't have voice, and we do have collective voice. There's so much power in collective voice. Please, I mean, how many of us, including myself, how many of us have counseled our voice before we haven't even a chance to use it, by saying, oh, we can't do that, we can't push that, going to listen to us? But we have voice, and the fact that this happened was just terrific. So that was one of the things I'm just most proud of, that we got it done.
Yeah, thank you, Dinah. Do you want to add to that, Patu?
Yeah, I mean, super similar, a little bit of an echo. I feel like at times I think, especially going into COVID together, it was like really, uh, because now we realize they're layered crisis, Um, and so I think just having that moment before things got real was good, just to have one last I brought my child with me to when we were pitched into Dow. And so I think it felt really good to just feel like important to the group. And then similar, like I like that we had a sentiment that sometimes we're in our own pain, which is valid, but other times I think we felt like we wanted to lift everybody up, and that overall is the vibe. And I really like that too, especially as a Native person. I think a lot of times we get invisibilized even within justice spaces. And so I think the sentiment just towards wanting, everybody to experience climate justice felt really good.
Yeah, amazing. Did you want to share anything, Jamie? I mean, you were definitely on a different role than Dinah and Patu, being kind of the facilitator of all that. So for you, what was something that made you feel really proud about how the process was developed?
I think, well, I think I'm so proud of the fact that we did it. First of all, like there was a moment where I'm like, I don't know if it's gonna happen. There was a moment where they're like, do you really need your own task force? Can you just use this other community of color group over here and then just make them do this other topic? And I was like, no, like this, it's not transferable. Like like there are people who are dedicated to this issue, who care about this issue, and then those should be the folks at the table. And some of those people might overlap, but I really held true to that vision and making sure that we had broad representation and we were compensating people for their time, which was its own battle. And the fact that we were able to do that, to pay people for their time, to resource people, and then get it passed through council was huge. And I think one of the moments I felt the most proud was when folks presented to the King County Council. And, I just gave them a couple talking points and some slides, and Dino was one of them. And we're up there representing the work that they did. And um and having council member Nabowski just like gush about it, and Claudia Balducci gush about it, and just saying like, this is an immense amount of work and you all did an amazing job. And I think that was a really proud.
Thank you. Yeah, and thinking now, we're moving into the 2025 SCAP update, which I'm sure to you all is just crazy that we've even gotten to this point already so fast, really. And the world feels different, it looks different, just with like having the pandemic happened and where we're at now, like I was mentioning earlier with the federal funding coming down, and just the time that we're in now feels different. So what are some of the challenges that you potentially see ahead, or anything that you kind of want to just flag for people, as we go into this new phase of the SCAP update? And do you want to start this time, Patu, and share?
Yeah, I feel like for me, I just keep kind of emphasizing our current systems are super inequitable. And I know when I had the opportunity to talk to good old Mary Durkan, or what was her name? Durkan. Sorry. Um, uh, like she was going to like some mayor climate gathering, and I was like, we don't have bathrooms. Like, why are we, it's just like these things, especially when you're trying to stay hydrated, waiting for the bus forever, like infrastructure. But I keep thinking about, I think because Yakima fires are happening right now, I keep thinking about that, just how like we're experiencing these crises currently, and seasonally on a regular basis now. And I still just see a lot of white people in the climate sector. And I feel like it took me getting a master's to realize you don't need a degree, but you do if you're a person of color to get through the door oftentimes. And it's just not that, like, to me, like going hunting or going out traditional gathering, things like that. I'm like, this is the stuff you can't learn in books. And so I think a lot of it too is the amount of time capitalism, like takes of our lives. And then that's helping to fuel this like massive extraction that's happening. And I meant to name that just like the impact versus the intent of legislation. A lot of our climate, and environmental stuff does result in a not in your backyard type stuff. And then things still happen. It's just disproportionately impacting people of color throughout the world, in addition to locally. Um, and so, yeah, I just think more opportunities within the sector would be great, especially for those formerly incarcerated. And I always still feel like I need to do better on supporting youth. I'm trying to be a good parent. But in reality, a lot of us adults hoard power. I do. I need to
Thank
share
you.
power and
Yeah,
figure
one of
out how to
my
do it.
Yes, one of my most beloved mentor always tells me, if you're 30 something and you don't have youth mentors, then like, what are you doing, And I'm really thinking about that because I'm about to be someone's 30 something coworker, and who are my youth mentors, And so I think that's so, so important. Thank you, Patu. What do you think, Dinah? What are the challenges you foresee, and maybe anything we should keep in mind with that?
Yeah, I agree with Patu. I would add sustainability for the work, staying the course. I've already heard and read articles about Biden pulling back some of the initiatives that he put forward and the funding that he put forward, delaying things. And, we are always challenged by, Jamie talked about how, we put this in the plan so that we wouldn't have to worry about new administration coming in. We don't have that luxury but with federal legislation, every 4 years there could be a turnover of the president. So the money that trickles down to communities from the federal government, that could be decreased, or someone doesn't have the staying power because we know the power of corporate America getting into the to the ears of our politicians and saying, "Oh, you're moving too fast," or claiming that some of the fossil fuel things that they're doing are actually climate change, right? It's like the fossil fuel industry is saying, "Oh, we're doing all this for climate change," and it's just the ruse. So making sure we have that staying power, and as Patu said, making sure that we have a future of young leaders of color and at the margins and from frontline communities who have an opportunity to be involved in this work. And I think it's really important to make the language that we use accessible to people so that they understand what we're talking about, because this is happening in communities and they have a very good understanding. But sometimes we talk on a level that people are like, what are they talking about? The nomenclature is just can be so complex. And I do think that's a way of keeping some of us out of the door, from being involved. And so, making sure that, you know, um, again, we see ourselves reflected in the work that's going forward. We see that we have the opportunity for community-driven solutions, and so those are just some of the things I would say are challenges.
Thank you. What about you, Jamie? What are some of the challenges you're seeing?
Not so much challenges as like things I would keep an eye on is like always keeping an eye on the power piece of who is getting a say and how are they getting a say and who's making the decisions. So I think in a lot of other spaces I've been in, there's this, well, we don't have time to engage community, or we don't have time to like do this long process you did. And I'm like, you can still do a short process effectively that is in partnership. You know what I mean? And so this false dichotomy that I see this in so many different spaces of oh, I have to choose urgency or equity. And that's not a choice. It's not a real choice. Like it's not one or the other. Like you can have both. And so I think that's something that I always like to keep an eye on. And then the other thing is, as we've seen across the country, this like divestment in DEI is to pay attention to how that might show up here. And how do we ensure that equity and anti-racism and all these things continue to be central to how we do that and not lose any ground?
Yeah, thank you. And to close out our panel here, so we want to think about also with hope for the future and really put those seeds here, because I do think, as we've seen throughout history in all types of movements for Black liberation, Indigenous liberation, like the radical imagination is so important, us imagining collectively what can be the future. So that's part of it. So I want to ask you all, what are your hopes for the future for climate justice policy in our region? What are you dreaming, Patu? What does that look like for you in the future?
I feel like I kind of went into it a little bit, but I think for me, like especially like I worked like way too long without benefits, and I still feel like I'm having like the more privileged experience within this context, and I want to see like the end of violence against our people, especially really anyone that's experiencing it disproportionately. And so that would mean like a shift, away from incarceration and lack of culturally relevant services to something more sustainable. And so I think one piece I would love us to think about too is like the peak uses around energy, but also exports. And then I don't want to see the transition result in the loss of jobs, especially for people of color. And so like, what does it look like to truly involve us in stuff and share? And I know a lot of you are working on anti-displacement, you know, through your own experience, but also through at an organizational level. And I think it's really important. With that said, we definitely need salmon for climate futures, and salmon does have other relations. Like we don't talk about it much in the summertime, but the aquatic experiences are really essential for the biodiversity that supports resiliency. And I agree with Dinah, it should be accessible too. I feel like that, you know, especially when we get to hear the youth talk about things, like it's just really empowering. I'll just close out mentioning like the trauma informed piece. Like when I was at ATNI, the youth were reacting to Sam's experiences, and I just got attuned to how normalized that trauma was. And it was like, oh yeah, this isn't cool. But we are in a position right now where we can actually change our futures. And I think through collective effort. And so, yeah, I think that would be it's hard not to ramble. I just think justice is in our community, and so the more we can be engaged with government and other entities, the better. But I would love to see justice situated in our neighborhood, in our region experiences, and outside of government, outside of academia.
Yeah, thank you. Anything you want to add, Dinah, to hopes for the future of climate justice policy?
Yeah, and in part two, touch on something. I think more really exposing people to, like, you know, how does the salmon fit into our biodiversity and all of this. You know, someone mentioned earlier about, I think it was Jamie, about people want to know what's happening to our trash. It's important to educate people. I was thinking, you know, we need to do a visit up to Brightwater, Samara. You know, let's go up, take our task force there and let them learn about what's happening there and how that fits into climate change. And I mean, the more exposure and education around these issues. And I saw something very hopeful today, Jamie. You might have saw it happen in your home state in Hawaii, where there was a settlement of a lawsuit that the youth had against the state of Hawaii. Did you see that? Where they were suing them because of all the greenhouse gas that was going into the atmosphere, and they were saying, "Hey, you're making it unsafe for us to live here. You're not being good stewards of our environment because you're going to be dead, and we're going to have terrible air to breathe." And so they were suing them and saying, "You got to get these emissions down." And so they settled that case today. Uh, and that was just hopeful to see that youth. This was someone say it's the first time youth have sued, you know, around this climate change issues, and they got you know, what they wanted through that lawsuit and decided to settle the case. And so that's really hopeful because I think we're going to see that happening throughout the country and throughout the world. And you know, youth really saying, here are some solutions, and coming up with really creative ways to hold people accountable, hold the state accountable, hold the county and other government accountable for what's happening. And that's one of the ways we're going to get to some really long lasting change.
Thank you, Dinah. And Jamie, do you want to close us out on any hopes you have after seeing all this process and what's to come?
I think just like also as a former youth worker and someone that still works with youth, I so resonate with what both Patu and Dinah said of like, our young people are amazing. We have youth on the task force now who are also amazing. We have, you know, that are all, these are the folks who are really pushing for big change and are gonna take over when we're tired too, right? Like, and they are really the folks that give me hope and continue to push me forward in doing this work. And Samara, I was told we are officially yelders at this stage. When you pass 30, you become a yelder, a young elder.
I'm not 30 yet, so I'm in the making of a yelder.
You'll be a yelder soon enough.
Love it.
Well, I wanted to close out with one last Mentimeter. And Samara will also talk about our raffle. So don't leave until you hear about the raffle.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead.
So the Mentimeter is in the chat. And I'm going to move to the next question for if you can just add something that you're taking away from today's workshop.
Thank you, Jamie. And while folks are putting in responses, I'll just say right now a verbal reminder. So we, are recording this workshop. So I will work probably between tomorrow and Wednesday. It's such a busy week, but I'll make sure to get this up in our webpage, which I did promise I would talk about. And I will also send the post survey, but then also just some resources about that we mentioned in the PowerPoint and how folks can get involved. And then also just wanted to say thank you to the three of you. Again, I don't think I had taken as much time to reflect on, like, again, my position wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for all the work y'all have done. And so I just feel really glad to continue this legacy of really powerful, in particular, women of color. That's really important to me. To have strong matriarch. I think it's definitely a pushback to colonial ways to like continue matriarchal lineage and wisdom. So thank you so much to all of you for the work that you do. And some of the responses are coming in. We're getting lots of gratitude, taking a holistic view on the nature of climate work, importance of approaching partnerships. And then, sorry, what I just wanted to do was pull up our webpage. Is this what it is? Yes, so we have a webpage where you can read a little bit more about the task force and the learning series. I'll put it here in the chat. And then let's see, there's been some call out about the anti-displacement and justice work. And then did you want me to share now the slide, Jamie, about the post survey?
Sure. Keep filling out the Mentimeter and leave that open.
Yes, thank you. So we want to also hear your thoughts about the workshop and feedback. So we have this link, or you can use the QR code if you want to fill it out now on your phone. Here's that link. And we have 2 books to raffle off from your responses to the post survey. Dinah got to see me and Jamie really get excited about picking out which books we wanted to feature. And the reason why is, we think that these are other ways to continue passing on education. And in particular for this workshop, we wanted to share books that just allow us to think about different systems and question how we do things. So they might not feel necessarily climate focused, but I think there's intersection in both of these books. Or if you're not wanting a book, we also offer a $25 gift card to support a local business if you are chosen as the raffle winner. So please make sure to submit that post survey by next Tuesday. I'll send out a reminder with that. And yeah, thank you again for everyone who showed out, especially in such a sunny day. We really appreciate it. Again, we will be taking a break between the months of July and August on our climate justice learning series workshops, but we will be back in September, and you all will be definitely on that email listserv to get a notice about it. Yeah, thank you again so much for making time today. And thank you to our awesome panelists and Jamie for all that extensive history.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Patu and Dinah.
Thank you. By the way, I have to say I was so impressed with our panel. Sometimes you listen to these panels, national panels, and it's like, damn, that was good. But some of these ideas and suggestions, they were really good.
I love it. Yes, we're hearing lots of gratitude in the chat as well. Thank you. Oh, and thank you to our interpreter, Martha, as always. We really appreciate you.
Sorry we were so fast, Marta.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.